Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? Quiet, please. Thank you. So this is going to be the presentation for you for Thursday. What is that? April the 23rd. Continue to encourage you guys to actually watch these videos. Watch the CNN Cold War video afterwards. Get in contact with me if you need help. You need guidance on your history IA. I know we've got that first draft due date coming up. And I know there's like extended essay coming your way as well. I've had meetings with some students giving them guidance on their history IA. I know that there's some limitations as far as some research tools not available, like libraries that would normally be available. But in any event, yeah, get in contact with me. You can do a real decent first draft. And yeah, so get in contact with me through email. We can set up Zoom meetings and what have you. All right, so let's get our attention to what we're going to be focusing on here today with my presentation and then the video following up with CNN Cold War Episode 3. So you can turn to page 3, excuse me, yeah, page 3 and Episode 3. This is the Marshall Plan. Let's go ahead and get my screen up here. All right, here we go. This is the Marshall Plan, and this is a very, very big deal early on in the Cold War. During President Truman's administration, Joseph Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union. World War II is not that long over, and things are pretty tough, especially in Europe, which is where a lot of the attention is going to be going to today. This right here is George C. Marshall, was the top commander of the United States military during World War II. Some of you guys may recall. He was the one that President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, I can't afford to send him, General George C. Marshall, off to be a field commander over in Europe or wherever. I need him in Washington, D.C., organizing and getting all the logistics for the United States to carry out war in 2 different fronts. So he is going to be tapped as well. He's a great statesman. He's going to be tapped as well by President Truman in the role of Secretary of State. So now he goes into a top diplomat position. And during his tenure as a Secretary of State, the European Recovery Act, or Recovery Plan, is going to be implemented by Congress. And it's going to be ultimately known as the Marshall Plan. It's his idea. He have to implement it, have to carry it out. And so that's why we know it historically as the Marshall Plan. Very, very strong leader. You hear a lot about him. My nephew and niece went to George C. Marshall High School in Falls Church, Virginia. It's named after him. So anyway, yeah, Marshall's a big deal. It's going to be very fascinating as far as what's going to be going on in this particular episode. We look at different challenges going on in Europe, as we did before with civil war breaking out in Greece, and Soviets putting pressure on Turkey and so forth. A lot of attention in this episode. These notes are going to be toward Italy, and in fact, you've got in Italy after World War II. You know, you've got a group of people that actually gained a lot of popularity and status in Italy because they were big opponents of Mussolini's fascist regime before and during World War II. This is the Communist Party. There were 2 million members of the Communist Party in Italy. And they weren't necessarily all like, you know, tied into Joseph Stalin or had the same views that he did as far as how to run a country, but nevertheless, they shared communist ideals. And operating in Italy's, you know, new democratic system that was set up after World War II, there's concern. It's the Cold War. There is concern that if Italy elects a bunch of communists, that Italy will voluntarily leave the West and, you know, alliance and friendly relations with, you know, Western countries, democracies, capitalist countries, and establish themselves as a pawn of the Soviet Union. Will that happen? So it's interesting because Yugoslavia, right across the Adriatic Sea, just to the east, that's a communist country with Tito. And for a number of reasons, they did not want to be close allies with the Soviet Union, nor were they forced to. Remember, there were no Soviet troops in Yugoslavia. So we're going to be looking at this during this time period. And the threat of economic collapse, that's just going to be a huge one. kind of going through that in the world in this country this time. I mean, lots and lots of money being set aside by Congress, borrowed by the United States government to help the United States during this difficult economic crisis during the coronavirus. And you had this challenge as well. I mean, World War II was very expensive. We went heavily into debt to fight World War II. And then afterwards, we open up the pocketbooks again to make sure that the world, particularly Western Europe, can bounce back economically, successfully from the challenges that it's facing. Because otherwise, what would happen? I mean, it's like the Soviets going to move in and like take advantage. Well, that's exactly the concern. I mean, we're picking up on a lot of the same things that we talked about last time. And we've got, you know, part of an answer. The United States will come up with money in the form of loans, low interest loans. The Marshall Plan will be about 20% of the Marshall Plan is low interest loans. And then the other 80% is outright grants. That's just like free money. And we're going to be sending that to all kinds of different countries that apply for it. Anyway, we'll look at the details as we go along through that. So there we go. There it is. The European Recovery Plan, also known as the Marshall Plan. We're going to have like sometimes it's going to be money. Sometimes we'll actually send physical things over, you know, lots of bags and boxes and various different things. And we're going to make sure, you know, supplied by the United States of America, from the United States of America, so that folks know that this is what's going on. And the Soviets, as they hear about it, they don't like it. They look and are very suspicious. You know, like, oh, we're the United States. We're just looking in to help everybody out. We're the good guy. We want to make sure that the recipients of this aid end up having stable democracy, you know, a fair amount of capitalism as well, and not go and become part of the Soviet realm. Now, as far as countries that are under the control of the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, would they like to have some of that American money? They might. In fact, quite a few of them do, but they're not going to get it. And that's not because the United States isn't going to provide it. It's because the Soviet Union is going to say no. And of course, American companies ultimately benefit because the United States businesses, our economy, our manufacturing sector, which is really big at that time, and a big, big percentage, I want to say close to half of the percentage of the manufacturing capacity of the world at that time. I mean, we're whipping out all kinds of machines and cars and all kinds of things. We're selling them to Europe. So it actually helps US businesses, the Marshall Plan as well. So let's look at the details as they come through. Okay, here we go. Stalin, head of the Soviet Union, and there's the map to help you remind them, everybody what's going on. Those areas, dark red, part of the Soviet Union. Pink, part of the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, with increasingly communist Soviet influence. We got Yugoslavia right here. That's Tito. He's communist, but there's no Soviet Red Army in there. And of course, Albania is an interesting one. They end up being kind of aligned with the Soviet Union. When the Marshall Plan ultimately comes in, oh, sorry, back up here for a moment. When the Marshall Plan comes in, you know, the United States and the countries that go along with the Marshall Plan and that receive the aid, Eastern European countries are not going to be in a position where they'll be able to, because Stalin's going to basically say, no, we already have our own political organization that those countries are forced to be into. That's the COMINFORM, okay? COMINFORM is the political alliance of those Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union. Oh, and they also get their own economic plan. It's not a gathering in San Diego with cosplay people. It is Comic-Con. It is the economic alliance of the Soviet Union. And of course, much of it is meant to benefit the Soviet Union and, of course, communist state-run, no private sector type system set up in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, as well as Bulgaria. That's what's going to be going into place, okay? Interestingly enough, let's talk about the situation in Czechoslovakia. Oh, that's not a good sight. Yeah, in Czechoslovakia, let's get right to the point because it's not going to be very pretty. Czechoslovakia was one of those few Eastern European countries that actually did have democracy, full-on democracy, before World War II. And they wanted to have democracy again. And there were people in Czechoslovakia who were like, yeah, let's have our democracy again. And one of them was a man by the name of Jan Masaryk. He ended up in a position, top position, foreign minister. And of course, you've got the Red Army there, and Jan Masaryk is interested in being in a position where Czechoslovakia, I don't know, could be like Austria or something, could be like a neutral country. Do they have to actually be part of a Soviet alliance? Can they take in some Marshall Plan aid? Well, what happened in Czechoslovakia is going to be very important, because what happened in March of 1948 is going to be during the time that Congress in the United States is considering whether or not to go along with this proposal that Truman has, this Marshall Plan, European Recovery Plan. It's a lot of money. I mean, really, is it worth it? I mean, that's just throwing money at Eastern Europe. I mean, are the Soviets really that much of a threat? I mean, do we really need? Well, Jan Masaryk was found dead outside the window of his home. And there was a lot of speculation that he had been, in the words of the history of Prague, he had been defenestrated. That had happened right before the 30 Years' War in the 16th century, or the 17th century. Was he thrown out the window? A lot of people suspect he was. The official verdict, was that, oh no, he committed suicide and so forth. In any event, he was not a big fan of the Soviets pushing folks around in the Czechoslovak government, but the Soviets were putting more and more pressure, and they kind of wanted him out of the way. And so, likelihood, he was killed. Made it look like a suicide. Yeah. And that didn't go over very well in a lot of parts of the world, including the United States of America. Look at the dates. The very next month, the United States Congress passed the first appropriations bill funding the European Recovery Plan, also known as the Marshall Plan. $5 billion. Doesn't sound like much now, but back in those days, that was a big, big chunk of change. $5 billion. And as I mentioned, some of it in repaid loans, 20% of it in repaid loans, low interest loans, and the other 80% is just write out money. And take a look here. We've seen this map before, this chart before. This is interesting because it shows you the countries that are going to be the main recipients of the Marshall Plan aid. You're going to see that France, which had been devastated during World War II, and Britain and Italy and West Germany and Netherlands and Belgium, they're going to receive a lot of aid. Even Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, a little bit to Iceland, Turkey, and Greece. And we'll get to this later on. There is a country right here. This one right here, Yugoslavia. Doesn't show up on this map, but they ultimately will also get some Marshall Plan aid. None of the Eastern European countries. Stalin was going to say, nope, sorry. You guys are maybe interested in it, but it's not going to happen. But it's over 4 years, over the 4 years that the Marshall Plan was in effect, $13.5 billion sent off in direct loans, direct grants, or equivalent value to 16 different countries. Okay, it's going to come in different ways, and it's really cool. In the video, you're going to see different ways that it comes up. But it's one of those things. It's like no string. There is going to be some strings attached to this. It's not all just like, here, have some fun. I mean, part of it, like for example, Greece, part of the goal is to stabilize the economic, political situation in Greece so that it will be a reliable pro-Western democracy, capitalism, and so that will help put down the possible spread of communism and Soviet influence in Greece. Okay, so one of the things that happened in Greece during the war was a lot of their donkeys, agricultural field animals had been killed. So the United States, as part of the, here we go, $700 million of value that went to Greece, they get a lot of American mules, and it's fascinating. We sent over these Missouri mules, which are actually quite big compared to the little Greek donkeys, and it's going to help, the farmers, because they're going to be able to plow their fields and get to work and stabilize the situation. I mean, so yeah, there you got a Missouri mule. pulling a whole bunch of aid to Greece from the United States. You can tell it's from the United States. Okay. What about other countries? Well, France was very interesting. Let's look at the situation in France. France, I mean, they've got a revolutionary history. I mean, when things don't go the way the French people like it, they go on strike or they have a revolution. And in 1947, a lot of the workers working at the large automobile company known as Renault, they went on strike. They were asking for better wages, better job protections, and so forth and so on. And yes, there was the influence of people who were associated with the Communist Party in France, similar to what the situation in Italy. There were communists in France, and they were opposed to the Nazi regime. They were opposed to, the Vichy, collaborationist regime that was in the southern part of France. They were part of the Free French movement, and so they had some credibility after the war. But the United States was not real keen on having France, go communist or go neutral. The United States and others were counting on the French to be a key part of our military alliance, and so there's some strings attached. The money for France was held up. $2.7 billion of money did not get to France until the strike was over and Renault was back in charge of automobile production and so forth. Okay, so you need to make sure that that takes place. So yeah, there's some kind of strings attached there as well. I mentioned Yugoslavia. There we go. The communist dictator, Marshal Tito, he wanted Marshall Plan aid. He doesn't have to listen to Stalin. Stalin hated him eventually. I mean, Stalin was sending assassins to try to kill Tito, and they never did. Tito outlived Stalin. But Tito was looking at his like, I can kind of play this thing both ways, right? I mean, I'm a communist leader and yada, 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 but I can also, cozy up to the West, and yeah, I can take some of the money. So they did. They got ultimately $150 million in aid in the year 1950. And yeah, I mean, people ask, did the Marshall Plan work? It did. It helped to stabilize the situation in Europe, economically, politically, and from a Cold War perspective, it helped to solidify. Let's go back to the map here. It helped to solidify these various different countries in a pro-Western alliance. I mean, pretty much the only ones that got aid that weren't part of our military alliance thereafter were Sweden. They were able to play neutrality, and Switzerland were able to play neutrality effectively during World War II, and they stayed neutral. Austria, as we mentioned before, and we'll see this again later, Austria is not going to be able to sort of take sides. They got Soviet troops there left over from World War II. They're going to have to be neutral. But all these other countries are going to, Britain and so forth, Norway, Denmark, even countries that had been neutral before, they're going to receive Marshall Plan aid. They're going to stabilize. They're going to ultimately be part of the Western Alliance, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? So I'm going to turn our attention, and the video does this as well. This is a very fascinating thing. One of the things that was taking place, of course, during this time period of free elections is, we mentioned before, Italy, right? So prior to, okay, I need to mention this. There is going to be a big election in Italy, right? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. But one of the interesting things that also takes place in the United States, and this is going to be ongoing, it's still there today. In 1947, a law was passed called the National Security Act, and it did a number of things, right? I mean, it created the Department of Defense. Oh, we didn't have one before? It's called the Department of War, which sounds very warlike. So now we're the Department of Defense, which sounds very defensive-like. Okay, well, that's cool. It also created the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, we had an intelligence agency before that, the OSS, but now we've got the CIA. Okay, well, what is that? What difference does that make? Well, let's look at this. So also created the National Security Council, which is going to be giving advice to the president. Key thing that you need to know as we look at this National Security Act, as we go through the Cold War, the president is going to have more power. And the federal executive branch is going to have more power to deal with Cold War things like, the spread of communism and dangers, national security dangers in different parts of the world. And is Congress going to have oversight to see how these things are carried out? Well, sometimes it's like, oh, we're doing the right thing, and you just, mind your own business, Congress. And other times, eventually, Congress is going to look and go, you did what? you shouldn't have done that. I mean, we're supposed to be the good guys. You're not supposed to be like taking out leaders. I mean, did we like during the Cold War, did we participate in like, you know, taking out leaders? It's a complicated, very interesting story. And it actually starts out fairly mild. All right, it starts out some of the earlier implementation of some of the powers of the National Security Act take place, as we're going to talk about here, in Italy. Okay, the United States is really interested in the outcome of the Italian election. They got a national election, and Italy's always got these elections and so forth. One of the interesting features about Italian politics before, you know, Mussolini came into power in the 1920s, and then after Mussolini was dead and Italy became democracy again after World War II, they tend to have a lot of elections. There's a lot of different political parties, and they form various different coalitions, and then they kind of fall apart, and then they have another election. And so it's very, very rare for one political party to have a majority. Usually you have like a coalition of political parties, and then if one part peels off, then you have to have another election. So it's very fascinating, Italian politics. Well, they had a national election set up in 1948, right? And you had a coalition of left-wing parties, including the Communist Party and Socialist parties and other left-wing parties. They were known as the Popular Front. They felt like they really had an opportunity to be successful, and they were going to win some elections, right? I mean, they, you know, they weren't collaborating with the right wing and then the fascists and so forth during the war. So they're thinking things are going to go pretty well for them in this free election coming up. But the United States and others that are concerned about the spread of communism and the beginning parts of the Cold War, they don't leave things to chance. This is fascinating because in our country, have we had other countries, Russia, try to influence the outcome of our elections? You know, how big of an impact have they had? I mean, that's interesting and debatable, but the fact is that people like to, other countries sometimes like to influence the election results in the United States of America. Was the United States interested in influencing the election results in Italy in 1948? Yes. Yes, we were. And what methods did we use? They're fairly mild compared to some of the things that can be done and will be done over time during the Cold War. But the basic message is this: we are going to, I mean, write these down, all these notes and so forth. We have, you know, our CIA is going to help get money, right? So that's easy. Get money to the right-wing parties, to the parties that are opposing, you know, the Communist Party and so forth. And that money can be used for organization, for propaganda, for posters and so forth. And the message is basically fairly simple. The Popular Front is Soviet influence, therefore it's very, very bad, right? I mean, just look at what happened in the Soviet Union itself, and you can talk about some of the things that have happened in Soviet-dominated Eastern European countries, and it's very, very bad. I mean, they're atheistic, and they're anti-capitalistic, and they're anti-democratic. Well, they are running in a democratic election, but they're very, very, very bad. And we need to do all the things we can to stop it. One of the things, this was remarkable, in the United States, they organized Italian-American families to write letters back to their relatives, their Italian relatives that are still in Italy, and encourage them to not vote communist, to vote for one of the, you know, right-wing parties, you know, center-right parties like the Christian Democrat Party, which is the main right-wing party in Italy. And so I mean, it's cute, you know, people writing letters to their cousin in Italy and saying, you know, don't vote for the Communist Party. They're bad. Soviets are bad. Another person that got very involved in the election was the Pope. The Pope is in the Vatican. The Vatican is in Rome. Italy is pretty much more like 90+% Catholic, and some of the Catholics actually were communists, which is kind of an interesting dynamic going on there and so forth. And the Pope was not interested in seeing Italy go communist. And so he basically called it a holy war. I mean, an election. And you'll hear from some of the communists in the film who are Catholic, and they're like, he was excommunicating communist. You're out of the Catholic Church if you're communist. You can't have the two. You can't be like a person of faith, Catholic, and a communist. That's what the Pope said. He's the head of the Catholic Church. So that had a big, big impact upon many, many people in Italy. So what looked like was going to be potentially an election where the Popular Front might come out in front and have a majority coalition in the election. After a huge effort to prevent them from winning, there's the results, right? Each of those little dots represents a seat in the Italian National Assembly, I believe it is, or one of the legislative bodies. And you've got the communists lost. Write it down. The communists lost big time. In fact, there wasn't a coalition government after this. There was a majority Christian Democratic government for a while after this election. It was a big, big, big election, landslide victory. All right. And Italy will continue having left-wing political parties, as will all kinds of other ones, but Italy will remain ultimately in the Democratic camp, in the capitalist camp, in the military alliance with the United States, British, French, and so forth. And that is the message that comes out very clearly in this episode, The Marshall Plan, talking about economic aid and economic influence and political influence and some of the, kind of sneaky stuff. It's going to be a theme we'll look at on both sides. Absolutely. On both sides. I mean, yeah, Soviets, one guy gets pushed out the window. For the Americans, yeah, they're spending money and writing letters. And that's the ultimate outcome of that election. So I think that wraps it up again. Get in contact with me. Keep working on those IAs. You want to do a real good job as best as you can, given the circumstances, on your first draft. Okay? All right. I'm out of here. You guys take care. Be safe.